Okay, so here is the third and final part of the lecture video for this week. All right. So, like I said, the Cold War was very much a part of the social changes discussed in the previous part of the video. And Americans increasingly defined life as private in contrast to communism, which was political and public. So, in a famous debate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in 1959, Richard Nixon pointed to a typical American kitchen inside a suburban house as an example of American superiority in the Cold War, saying, quote, "Any American steelworker could buy this house." Khrushchev responded, "Don't you have a machine that puts food into the mouth and pushes it down? Many things you've shown us are interesting, but they are not needed in life. They have no useful purpose. They are merely gadgets," end quote. So remember that the family room of the typical suburban house was invented in the 1950s to promote togetherness. Again, this is a triumph of private space over public space. So the idea of a private family life promoted family togetherness, but it also promoted social isolation, suspicion of outsiders, and an insensitivity to public welfare. Americans increasingly gathered around their television sets instead of talking to one another. This was a death of some of the larger aspects of public life. So there's an historical problem here that we need to talk about. Why suburbia? Why infrastructure matters in history? I know it's boring, but it's really important, and it's kind of cool if you ask me. So, pipes, freeways, housing, and social history. Here we go. The Depression and World War II were cramped, difficult years with very little housing available, and it forced Americans to make painful choices. To address the great need, some called for public housing of a familiar kind in Europe, multifamily apartment buildings located in cities near transportation, stores, and jobs where you could walk or take the bus to work. This is what President Truman called for in 1945. This was a choice that was made in post-war Asia and Europe. So the point is that American leaders had choices, and nothing was inevitable about the choice of suburbia, which was different from that. So instead, in the post-war years, the federal government massively subsidized a new kind of housing outside major cities and new developments. So suburbs were not inevitable. They were not even particularly likely. All other major industrial nations went for public housing after World War II. And slum clearance or urban renewal was the model in the US previously. So why suburbs? Well, 3 federal subsidies make the suburban boom possible: federally subsidized mortgages, federally subsidized freeways, and state and federal tax breaks. So before World War II, banks were often required a 50% down payment to purchase a house, and only issued mortgages for 5 to 10 years. So few Americans ever bought houses. I mean, how many of you could put down 50% of a house down payment right now? Right? Not a lot. So not a lot of people bought houses. Some inherited houses, some built their own houses, but most urban Americans were renters for life. So the American dream before 1945 did not include home ownership in these urban areas. But subsidy number 1, new federally guaranteed mortgages, came about. This is when you get the FHA and the VA and the HOLC, which is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, during the 1930s and World War II. These are all based on the GI Bill, all these subsidies, which require down payments of only 5 to 10% and guaranteed interest rates of 2 to 3% over as many as 30 years. This was a revolution in credit history: cheap, federally guaranteed credit. This was the foundation of the modern housing economy, and it creates a huge new construction industry, a new mortgage industry, banking, real estate industries increase. So there's a second subsidy, the federal road building projects that allowed suburbanites to get to and from their homes. This begins with the National Defense and Interstate Highway Act it was passed in 1956 under Eisenhower. It built 42,500 miles of highways at the cost of $25 billion. So think about the title, the National Defense and Interstate Highway Act. It used the Cold War to justify domestic spending, the idea that you could more readily move arms and troops and things if you had an interstate highway system. So, There are consequences for cities as freeways cut through them. Housing starts to grow from 114,000 in 1944, roughly, houses, to 1,692,000 in 1950. There are 13 million homes built in the 1950s, mostly in the suburbs. By 1950, suburban growth was 10 times faster than central cities. 18 million Americans moved there between 1950 and 1960. By 1970, suburban American plurality was created, and by 2000, it was a majority. So suburbs grew at the expense of cities and also rural areas. This third subsidy is taxes. Let's talk about Lakewood. In Lakewood, just north of Long Beach in California, it was twice the size of Long Island's more famous Levittown and contained the nation's first regional shopping center designed to draw shoppers from many miles away. The area was based on jobs for bombers and missiles at Douglas Aircraft Plant, the people who worked at the plant in nearby Long Beach, California. Threatened with annexation by Long Beach and Los Angeles, Lakewood's developers sought to incorporate it without actually having a city government. The result was the famous Lakewood Plan that was adopted throughout the country. This was a new type of Western innovation and it became a national trend. So Lakewood contracted its city services at cut rate prices from LA County, and it was subsidized by all county taxpayers. Lakewood could control zoning and land use without the cost of actually becoming a real city. So why did Los Angeles agree? Well, we can speculate. New suburbs required less fire attendants because new houses are safer, so the costs are lower there. There was less ambulance cost because the suburbs were filled with mostly young, healthy people. There were less police because the wealthy are often less often the victims of crime than the poor. So then California in 1956 allowed local governments to collect a regressive 1% sales tax locally. This allowed minimal city shopping center suburbs like Lakewood to fund city governments without raising property taxes. So they used sales taxes taken from people in surrounding cities to buy services provided by surrounding cities like ambulance, fire, etc. So this took money away from already weakened state, county, and older city governments. Minimal cities like Lakewood could zone out service demanding low-income renting communities and avoid property taxes. So since minorities happened to be disproportionately poor, they were left behind in the inner city. Whites moved away from blacks and toward low taxes, cheap mortgages, and newer, whiter communities. The Lakewood Plan would become the standard procedure for creating new residential-only suburbs nationwide. Did you hear that? The Lakewood Plan would become the standard procedure for creating new residential-only suburbs nationwide. They relied on federally subsidized roads and older central cities for services, but paid few of the costs of those services. At the same time, the federal government also passed tax benefits for home buyers. Those who could afford a loan often found it cheaper to buy than to rent, not only because of the cheap mortgages we talked about earlier, but also because Congress allowed homeowners to deduct the interest from mortgages. Current law permits deductions of the interest paid on combined mortgage debt up to $1 million on a primary residence and one additional residence. In addition, the interest paid on home equity loans of up to $100,000 may be deducted. Most beneficiaries earn $75,000 or more. This was an enormous tax break for homeowners, usually their biggest single deduction. It also cost the federal government hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. In 1986, under the Reagan administration, Congress ended deductibility for other forms of interest, but not mortgages. So my mortgage interest is deductible, but your credit card interest is not. Why not? So the other big so what of the Lakewood Plan, and this is really important, is that this suburban creation, like the Lakewood Plan, resegregated the suburban nation for as fast or faster than civil rights desegregated it. Like the West, for example, is massively segregated, like in California. So this began to link class and race even more heavily because the suburbs are going to be filled with upper class folks who are largely white. In the inner cities, you will find poorer peoples who are largely minorities. So the Lakewood Plan resegregated the suburban nation as fast or faster than civil rights desegregated it. So what were the social consequences of the movement out of cities and into suburbs? Well, at the same time that young, upwardly mobile white families moved out of cities and into suburbs, mostly composed of people like themselves, African Americans were continuing to move out of the rural South and into cities. By 1970, more than two-thirds of the total African American population had relocated to cities. More than half of the urban black population was concentrated in just 12 cities: Oakland and Los Angeles in California, Dallas and Houston in Texas, Chicago, Detroit and Cleveland, Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and Philadelphia, New York, and Newark, New Jersey. Every southern state except Florida saw large decreases in black populations, while those same states saw large increases in white suburban dwellers. So, at the same time that the civil rights movement had prodded state and federal governments to break down the walls of legally enforced segregation, or Jim Crow, in the South, the shift to suburbs was working to separate people even more effectively. The shift to suburbs segregated Americans by race, but also by class. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous dream to see an integrated America would in fact become true because of the destruction of racist laws forbidding blacks and whites to go to school together, to eat together, to be seen by the same doctors and dentists. But at the same time, Americans lived even further apart. Moving to the suburbs was, of course, a choice, and it brought many benefits to those who could leave the city. But it was also an economic imperative, a choice made possible and even made necessary by government subsidies and tax breaks. Was it really a choice? Were these suburbs entirely positive? It's important to remember that Americans tell stories about the past. The story we have often told about post-war suburbs is that they were places of individual opportunity, tight-knit families, and of freedoms to design one's own home and living space. But each of these stories needs to acknowledge how designed and also subsidized suburbs really were. The key role for the government, especially the federal government, in creating and funding suburban living needs to be examined here. Americans perceived suburbs as offering stability through conformity. This conformity, however, spurred resistance within and against suburbs. This resistance would appear in art, in music, in dress, and in behavior. So next week we will take up the topic of civil rights, the civil rights movement, another protest against post-war conformity. So for this week, that is all for lecture. In class, we will talk about the readings. And if you have any questions between now and then, as always, feel free to reach out. Remember that you'll have an attendance quiz due by the time we meet in class this week.